South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace is leading the effort to hold Dr. Fauci and the NIH responsible for taxpayer-funded experiments on dogs. According to a bipartisan letter signed by 23 House members, dozens of beagles were infected with disease-causing parasites in order to test experimental drugs on them.
The letter is in response to the White Coat Waste Project's findings on dog testing, but this isn't the first time we've heard of dogs used as guinea pigs, so to speak. Back in 2018, journalist Glenn Greenwald exposed the highly profitable industry of dog breeding for excruciating science experiments. Glenn joins us to weigh in on the allegations made against Fauci and explain more about animal testing in depth. Welcome, Glenn.
Good to be with you.
So, Glenn, can you give us some of the details of what these members of Congress are objecting to?
Sure. So the morality and cruelty of dog experimentation and experimentation on animals generally has been a cause of animal rights activists for decades. But this manifestation of Congresswoman Mace, and actually Rand Paul in the Senate is doing something similar, is the byproduct of a strategy by the White Coat Project, which you referenced, and other groups, to try and bring left and right together by making the focal point of these objections be federally funded animal experimentations that are particularly gruesome. So it isn't just an animal rights cause protesting, say, how corporations experiment on dogs and other animals, which is where the bulk of that experimentation happens, but it kind of smuggles this animal rights cause into the standard right-wing cause of eliminating wasteful federal spending by allowing the target to be how the government spends its money on unnecessary experimentation. And it's a very clever strategy that has brought together, not just centrists from each party, but actual members of the left and the right and lots of people in between in a coalition to protest these experiments that are being conducted ostensibly under the aegis of Dr. Fauci, at least the agency he controls, which gives another political boost to the campaign, given how Fauci has become a lightning rod of political controversy as well. So it's great to see, but it's very limited in its scope, and that's because of the politics involved.
Well, right. And so look, I have dogs. I love dogs. This was really horrifying to read. And of course, we know that there's experimentation on animals going on, even when we don't hear about it. I guess as much as I am motivated by animal welfare concerns, then the other side could say, well, these tests are necessary. They're going to save real humans if we have to do this testing on dogs. But then I'm looking, and it sounds like from reading this that, well, they have to test a certain number of non-human subjects or species before, like, the FDA will give approval, or so the government health agencies will give approval to move forward until you do this kind of testing. So is there's sort of like a government requirement that they do this really cruel sounding testing, from what I'm understanding. Is that accurate?
Right. So it reminds me a little bit of, say, the torture debate, and you can devise other examples where even people who want to prohibit the use of torture in government interrogations will have to concede that it is possible to concoct a scenario where at least it presents a morally difficult question, the kind of, cliched ticking time bomb case where you have a terrorist in your custody and he won't tell you where a nuclear bomb that's been planted is about to detonate that will kill 2 million people. And the only way you can find out is if you torture him, right? You can concoct a scenario where it becomes morally difficult. The same here is with animal testing. So you say, well, the only way to cure, say, a particular disease or a cancer that kills hundreds of millions of people around the world is if you experiment on dogs, which will enable you to find the cure. I mean, nobody could say that's an easy choice. But the reality, like in the torture case, where it's virtually never the case that is the actual scenario, there's almost never any pragmatic necessity to torture it, and there's no efficacy to it as well, because people tell you whatever they think you want to hear to stop the torture. The same is true here with these dog experimentations, where oftentimes it's done and there's zero medical value. For one thing, oftentimes it's not even done ostensibly to find a medical cure. It's done to perfect cosmetic products or industrial chemicals or things having nothing to do with human health. But even in the cases where they're doing it as part of FDA approval, most of the time, medications that are up for FDA approval will pass the safety phase when they try it on monkeys or dogs or cats, and then fail in humans, because even the 2 or 3% difference in our genetic code between dogs and monkeys and cats on the one hand and humans on the other, that sounds like a small difference, is actually enormous. So that almost always these experimentations are medically worthless.
And so some critics are saying that Fauci doesn't have a role in deciding how the NIH grants are distributed. According to the NIH, 24 institutes and centers, also known as ICs, award this funding. Each IC has its own appropriation from Congress, and the director of each IC decides what grants it will fund. I can see how shoehorning Fauci into this, like you said, helps get attention to this. I wonder if it polarizes it in the other way too. Are you going to start to have Democrats who say, well, if Fauci's involved with this, then I love torturing puppies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the real strength here is that these particular experiments where they've locked the heads of puppies inside a container to allow flesh-eating animals to consume their skin until they die, the worst, most torturous death possible, the most protracted and painful death imaginable, is sufficient to overcome even the liberal affection for Dr. Fauci. I mean, the reality is that in Washington, it's not illegitimate to ascribe responsibility to a senior bureaucrat for agencies under his control, even if he's not actually the one responsible for it. I mean, it's, Joe Biden gets blamed for failures of all kinds of agencies, even though he's not micromanaging what they do. Fauci's not ordering puppies to be tortured. It's still being done with budgets that he controls. I agree it's a little bit of a kind of distraction, a little bit of a political instrument, but sometimes in politics, you need to use what you have. I personally don't find the Fauci component of this particularly alluring, and I do think there's a risk, as you say, that it could polarize what is otherwise an issue that would bring everybody together. But for Republicans in particular, and these members of Congress who need to bring people onto an issue, animal rights, that has been traditionally kind of demeaned as a left-wing, boutique concern of vegans, it could be helpful politically to justify and to galvanize people to support it.
Over the summer, a panel at the Department of Veterans Affairs deemed dog testing conducted by the VA was unnecessary and that the agency should do more to justify limited use of canines and improve the lives of those still used. I mean, right, that's the other thing here, because, not only are they're experimenting on these dogs, I think they're going to end up kill the ones who survive the kind of flesh-eating process. So even if the experiments are necessary, there are still more humane ways to treat these animals, and it seems like that's just not a priority whatsoever for the government or for the people doing the experiments.
Right. I mean, I do a lot of reporting on the evils of factory farms, the moral atrocities to which sentient animals like pigs and cows and chickens are routinely subjected. So I have a fairly high tolerance level for being subjected to these things in a way that people who don't work on this regularly probably don't. But even given that resistance level, when I began reporting on what's done to in the dog experimentation industry, it's still very difficult for me even now to go read that article I wrote 3 years ago, because the immorality of it is so extreme. I mean, they breed these dogs into the world. It's not like they go and pick up shelter dogs, which would be bad enough for dogs off the street. They breed the dogs that have the characteristics that are most inclined to make them love humans. Beagles in particular have long been known for being most eager to engage in behavior that pleases humans, and that makes them very docile, which makes them ideal subjects for experimentation because they don't fight back and resist. They breed them into the world, so they create life as if they're gods. They put them in tiny little cages where they never experience any of the joys of canine life. They subject them to incredibly gruesome experiments, and then when they're done with them, they just throw them away. They just kill them. They just extinguish them, even though there are now funded groups like Beagle Rescue Group and others that are doing really great work, like they do with greyhounds, saying once you're done using these highly emotionally complex animals as though they're your commodity or your property, at least give them to us so we can find homes for them so they can spend the latter part of their lives being loved and just living a halfway decent life. And the government has even resisted that. Their view is once we're done with them, the easiest way is to just dispose of them and extinguish their lives.
And I think your torture analogy here is particularly apt, and not just because torture isn't just an analogy here; it's an actual fact. That's what they're doing, is they're torturing these puppies and their dogs. But it also does define the debate pretty well, because you have plenty of people who say, no, torture is wrong. We should not, as Obama said, we should not torture folks. You just as a matter of principle, it is evil to do. But that unfortunately doesn't get you to the majority that you need in this country to eliminate that type of cruelty. And so saying we shouldn't torture these animals just isn't enough. So you also have to then study the effectiveness. And just to underline this as the last question, is it fair to say that there is no medical purpose anymore, given the technological and medicinal advances that have been made over the last several decades? There's no purpose that is genuinely being served by this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I possess the necessary expertise to say with so much certainty that there is never, ever a case where you might be able to derive some marginal experimental benefit from experimenting on dogs. I can't say that there's never any longer a case that you could concoct. But what I can say for certain is that the overwhelming majority, almost all, if not all, of the experimentations conducted on puppies, on dogs, on these animals we've been evolved over 10,000 years to come to love and connect with on every level, are completely worthless from a medical and scientific perspective, either because their DNA is too different to yield any useful information, or, as you said, technology has advanced so that there are now alternative means to derive at least as reliable information, if not more so, that doesn't entail inflicting suffering. And if you're just a minimally decent human being, your position ought to be, all things being equal, we should avoid unnecessarily inflicting pain, torture, and suffering on animals that can feel sadness and pain and loss. And that's exactly what we're doing hugely in the private sector, but to a large degree as well with government money.
Glenn, thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to talk to you guys. Thanks for covering this.
Thank you. Kim Iverson is with us next. We'll discuss new reporting that 2 January 6th protesters allegedly had planned meetings with members of Congress and White House staff.